Nintendo has always been an experimental company, and the mid-90s was probably their most experimental era. They were on an absolute tear with futuristic ideas that, one after another, ended in failure. The Virtual Boy, the Satellaview, and the 64 disk drive all turned into embarrassing money pits. Even their main console, the N64, was selling so poorly that Nintendo called it a crisis. But there was one more oft-forgotten failure, known as Nintendo Power. It was a Japan-only cartridge rewrite system that delivered exclusive Super Famicom games for series like Mario, Kirby, and Fire Emblem. But there was supposed to be even more, and new Game Boy and N64 titles were planned as well, and according to Nintendo, maybe even disk drive games. But some fumbles led to the system's early demise before those goals could become reality. Nintendo Power didn't only make new exclusives, it also remade classics from the past, resurrected previously cancelled projects, brought foreign titles to Japanese shores, and preserved Satellaview games that would have otherwise gotten lost to time. It also made hundreds of back-catalogue games available for only $8 each, as sort of a proto-virtual console before the modern internet. Nintendo Power was ahead of its time. Too far ahead, unfortunately, while in some ways lagging behind the times. Its failure left fans with a mountain of coulda, shoulda, wouldas, as you'll soon hear from some Japanese gamers who were there in its heyday. And for us Western fans stuck in the present, we were denied its fruits too. Just as we never got to play dozens of 64DD games that, if things had played out differently, could have been passed down through time. So let's dive deep into the decade-long lifespan of Nintendo Power, from 1997 to 2007. What it gave us, what we missed out on, and how, even in death, it shaped the gaming world we know today. At Space World 97, Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi gave a speech warning that video game distribution was on the verge of collapse. When publishers launched a new game, they didn't know how many cartridges to print. If they underestimated demand, they'd miss out on millions in unrealized sales. Overestimate, and they'd lose millions, and get stuck with literal tons of unsold copies that were expensive to produce. One wrong forecast could bankrupt an entire studio. The distribution of video games is truly facing a crisis of collapse, with profits and high risks, Yamauchi told his audience. Some game makers may be profitable, but most of them are not, and the situation's steadily escalating. Despite his ripe old age of 70, Yamauchi was always very forward-thinking. A couple years earlier, Nintendo tried beaming games down to Super Famicoms via satellite. That system failed to catch on, but at the very moment Yamauchi was talking, Nintendo was rolling out a new form of distribution, Nintendo Power. There'd be thousands of kiosks all across Japan, in every Lawson convenience store, open 24 hours a day, and it'd use digital distribution to solve the cartridge manufacturing crisis. If you've never heard of Lawson, it's similar to 7-Eleven, and in Japan, there's always one around the corner. At the time, the country was home to about 7,000 Lawsons, meaning per capita, there's more of them than there are McDonald's in America. In 1997, every Lawson started installing multimedia machines, called Loppies, where you could pay your bills, book movie tickets, buy CDs, stuff like that. They sought out Nintendo because they wanted to sell video games too, and eventually the two megacorps worked out a deal where every Loppy would have a built-in Nintendo Power system. Gamers could buy a blank Super Famicom flash cart for $30 and write up to 7 games onto it. Nintendo Power cartridges were white to differentiate them from standard carts, with numbers 1 through 7 on the front. You could get stickers with game icons and stick them on the numbers to show which games were inside. New games at retail could cost $75, but on Nintendo Power, most were only $8. In theory, Nintendo Power was a win-win for everyone. Gamers got cheap games, Lawson got gamers coming into their stores, hopefully buying other stuff while they were there. and Nintendo got to keep their last generation console thriving and sell games without worrying how many cartridges to print. Keep in mind, this was a year after the N64 launched, and it wasn't selling well. In Japan, it had only sold 1 million units, which isn't just less than PlayStation, it's less than the Sega Saturn. There were, however, still 17 million Super Famicoms in Japanese homes. Super Famicom was very popular there, and a lot of people were still playing it. So the plan was for Nintendo Power to not just sustain, but revitalize the console, and Nintendo announced their business was now made up of 3 core pillars: the N64, Game Boy, and Nintendo Power. We said earlier that Nintendo Power was ahead of its time, but that doesn't mean it was the first of its kind. Nintendo actually had a similar system for rewriting Famicom discs back in 1987, though it didn't have any exclusives, and you could only have 1 game per disc. Rewrite systems existed even before Nintendo though, with Tekura machines for MSX, FM Towns, and other consoles you've probably never heard of. Those early rewrite machines were archaic by comparison, and are really stories for another day, so let's get back to Nintendo Power. The system was primarily a Marigold management project, who you might remember from our recent video about the 64DD. Basically, they were a collection of studios half-owned by Nintendo, who made games like Cubivore, Doshin the Giant, Hey You Pikachu, and were also involved with experimental hardware. Their leadership included Pokemon Company president Tsunekazu Ishihara and Masanobu Endo, who created Xevious and was personal mentor of Pokemon's creator Satoshi Tajiri. Nintendo was involved too, of course, but mostly it was Marigold running Nintendo Power, with Endo in charge as general producer. Their mandate comprised 2 distinct initiatives: the Let's Preserve Good Games project and the Star Wars project. The former aimed to bring the best of Nintendo's back catalogue to the system, along with a bunch of third-party classics, and sell them for $8 a pop. They weren't bringing back every game ever, just the good ones, so the selection was chosen by Endo, gaming magazine editors, and popular fan requests. Preserving good games was especially important at the time, because Sony, Square, and other publishers were suing secondhand shops, trying to outlaw used game sales. More on that later, but the point is, there was a very real risk old games were going to disappear, which is why the good ones needed preserving. The other initiative, the Star Wars project, focused on remaking and enhanced porting great games from Famicom and Game Boy, as well as competing platforms like Sega Genesis, PC Engine, MSX, computer, and arcade games. It didn't matter if the originals were made by Nintendo or not. They just wanted to update some classics. Remakes were relatively easy and quick to develop in only a few months, and helped in the overall goal of game preservation. At the same time, Nintendo and its partner studios were also making some brand new titles. The initial promise was Nintendo Power would get 1 or 2 exclusive new games or remakes every single month, for around $25 each. So all that's to say, Nintendo Power's early goals were pretty exciting. The system soft-launched in September '97 at 100 Lawson locations throughout Tokyo. On day 1, 14 back-catalogue Nintendo classics were on offer, plus 25 from third parties: Mario, Donkey Kong, Metroid, F-Zero, Fire Emblem, Earthbound, Castlevania, Mega Man, everything you're seeing now, and more. Over the next few months, dozens more third-party games got added, 1 PC port and 2 newish games called Heisei Era New Island of Ogres Volumes 1 and 2. They were a popular text-adventure duology originally on Satellaview, but now reworked for Nintendo Power. Soon after, a new magazine for the system's fans called Monthly Nintendo Power entered publication. And all that was before the system even reached its full strength in March '98, at which point Nintendo Power was in all 7,000 Lawsons across Japan, in various Nintendo stores and even some supermarkets. And the exclusives just keep on coming. The way it worked was that each month, every Lawson got a CD containing the full updated game library. The year kicked off with Wrecking Crew 98, a sequel to the Famicom original starring Mario and friends. Check it out, it's Peach's Castle in 16-bit, and it even came with the original game as a bonus. The next month brought Kirby's Superstar Stacker, a remake of a Game Boy game that had come out a year before, but now with better graphics, music, and some additional content like a new story mode. After that was Super Punch-Out, a Nintendo-made boxing game that had come out overseas years earlier, but never in Japan. Then Famicom Detective Club: The Girl Who Stands Behind, a remake of the 1989 visual novel Murder Mystery, with some content changed and added for a better experience, including an extra ending sequence. All these remakes had better visuals and music, so from here on out, that'll go without saying. Next was Super Famicom Wars, which had new unit types, nations, characters, and gameplay elements that hadn't been in the Famicom original. So much that people argue if it's actually a remake or really more of a sequel. Either way, it includes all 17 maps from the first game, plus 17 new ones. Super Famicom Wars had previously gotten 4 maps through Satellaview broadcasts, but didn't see full release till Nintendo Power. The next month was Derby Stallion 98, a sequel in the long-running Japan-only horse racing franchise, which is more about breeding and business simulation than the actual racing. Then Mini 4WD Let's and Go Power WGP2, the newest entry in an RC car role-playing series based on a 90s manga. There were also 3 reworked Satellaview games, Dr. Mario, Zoo Mahjong, and Sute Haken, that, like all Satella games, had only been available during the few hours they were broadcast, which were months, sometimes years earlier, and thus not readily accessible till they came to Nintendo Power. 98 brought some previously cancelled games too, like Namco's Super Family Slope and Messiah's Put It All in the Ring, which were completed years earlier, but never got released due to physical production costs. Both games were financially viable for the very first time, thanks to Nintendo Power's digital distribution. 1999 had some good games too, but before we go over those, a word from this video's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, available now for free on PC and consoles. Command over 2,500 vehicles from nearly a century of warfare and 10 major nations, from 1920s biplanes and armored cars to modern fighter jets and battle tanks. Immerse yourself in War Thunder's global community of over 70 million players and battle in intense PvP combat with incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound effects. War Thunder's in-house Dagor engine delivers stunning visuals and smooth performance, even on lower-end systems, for a lag-free experience. War Thunder's sophisticated damage model makes every individual component, engines, fuel tanks, etc. vulnerable to damage, with armor, shells, and missiles behaving just like their real-world counterparts. Use the X-ray view to see exactly how your vehicle was taken out, like which components were hit and with what. The game has 3 modes. Arcade has fast-paced action, Simulator provides the ultimate challenge, and Realistic mode strikes a balance between the two. War Thunder offers something for every type of player, and lets you customize your vehicles with countless camouflages, historical markings, and decorations, including community-created designs. Play War Thunder for free right now on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox by signing up via our link in the pinned comment or video description. New players and those who haven't played in the last 6 months can claim a massive bonus pack across all platforms featuring premium vehicles, the exclusive Eagle of Valor decoration, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account. This offer is for a limited time only, so act fast and claim your rewards now. And now, back to the trivia. So anyway, 1999 had some good games too, like Famicom Bunko Forest of Beginnings, an adventure game Nintendo considered a major release and a new IP they hoped would sell enough to bloom into a full series. Made by some of the same folks who did Earthbound, it's about a kid who goes to visit his grandpop in the countryside. Then, after meet-cuting a girl in the forest, then losing her, he's got to adventure through a village to find her again. It's sort of a slice-of-life game with themes of Shintoism, loss, and environmentalism, and everyone who played it loved it and said it left a heavy emotional impact. '99 was also the start of Picross NP, a series of 8 puzzle games centered around Nintendo franchises like Pokemon, Zelda, and Star Fox. Nintendo published a couple more remakes like Power Sokoban, based on the PC 8801 puzzle game, and Power Load Runner, derived from an American side-scroller that originally came out on Apple II. Meanwhile, Marigal was putting out enhanced ports of Wizardry 1, 2, and 3, which were influential first-person RPGs that also came from America and started on Apple II. They also released a new game, Tamagotchi Town, which was sort of a pet-raising god simulator society builder game. Then they made a slightly unique port of a first-party Sega game brought over from the Sega Genesis, called Columns. According to Famitsu, Marigal wanted to bring over Sega's Sonic the Hedgehog and Echo the Dolphin as well, but unfortunately couldn't pull it off. Later that year, Nintendo launched the system's biggest exclusive, Fire Emblem Thracia 776, a wholly original entry in their popular RPG tactics franchise. It's a sequel to Genealogy of the Holy War, and added new mechanics that have since become series staples, like Fog of War, capturing enemies, and achieving in-game conditions to unlock secret chapters. A few Nintendo Power exclusives could be pre-ordered as pre-written versions, which was a new flashcard with the game already installed. They were either cheaper than buying both separately or had some extra goodies thrown in. The most famous pre-write bundle was the Fire Emblem Thracia Deluxe Edition, which came with collectible cards, a couple of plushies, the World of Fire Emblem VHS with story and tutorials, a cloth map of the Thracian continent, some pins to keep track of where you'd been, and of course, the game itself. It cost $80 at launch, but nowadays sells for a whole lot more. Nintendo Power sounds awesome, right? There are a few more small exclusives from third parties, but we've already hit the highlights. So let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Do that, and you'll see, well, hardly anyone was actually using Nintendo Power. We talked to some Japanese fans who were there in its heyday. One guy who calls himself Satella A told us, "I don't think it was very popular. I never saw anyone rewriting other than myself. There were some small but enticing new games in the Nintendo Power library, but by then, the market had become Nintendo 64, PlayStation, and Sega Saturn, so Nintendo Power failed to gain prominence." Another guy, Haki, said, "Nintendo Power had popular and also harder to find games, and older ones were less expensive, and it was convenient combining multiple games onto one cartridge, but the storage space seemed small. And when you account for the $30 price of blank cartridges, it was actually cheaper to buy games at second-hand shops. Even for rarer old games, I could get them in their original packaging if I asked a shop to order it in. And if it's a rare game, I'd rather get it in the original box." Now's the part where we need to talk about how, despite Nintendo Power being awesome in concept, in execution, it actually kinda sucked. The system stumbled in 4 key areas: marketing, storage, price, and convenience. First, marketing. There wasn't much advertising for Nintendo Power, so hardly anyone knew about it. Loppy didn't have any Nintendo branding, so most folks walked right past it without knowing there were games inside. As a result, only die-hard Nintendo fans who subscribed to gaming magazines knew it existed. The second problem was storage. Those Japanese fans told us the flashcards were too small. And they're right, one cartridge only held 4 megabytes. Storage was divided into 8 F blocks for flash memory and 16 B blocks for save data. Nintendo boasted you could write up to 7 games, but in practice, you might only be able to fit 1 or 2. Just take a look. Here's those launch games we showed earlier, along with how many blocks they required. As you can see, quite a few take up the entire cart, and a lot more take up at least half. When you've got multiple games, the title select menu takes up 1 F block of its own, so you might only be able to get the game you want with enough space left for one small game, something like Space Invaders. So for example, 6 blocks for Super Metroid plus 1 for Space Invaders, and 1 for the menu. That adds up to 8 F blocks, and that's all you've got. So in reality, if you actually wanted 7 games, they'd mostly have to be old arcade titles. Some bigger games couldn't fit on a flash cart at all, like the 6 MB Tales of Phantasia. Even worse, some of the console's most popular games used a special chip, which Nintendo Power Carts just straight up weren't compatible with, like Super Mario Kart, Super Mario RPG, Yoshi's Island, Star Fox, and a few Kirby and Mega Man games. Star Fox 2 would have been a great finished but unreleased game to make exclusive to the system, but that wasn't possible because it needed a chip. Now the third problem, price. Old games were $8, and most new exclusives were $25, but there was also the upfront cost of a $50 cartridge. And when you wrote a game onto it, you weren't paying for ownership. If you deleted one to make room for another, the first game's gone forever. If someday you wanted to replay it, you'd have to repay for it. Loppy printed out receipts, so it would have been nice if Nintendo let you use them to show proof of ownership and re-download games for free. Unfortunately, they didn't let you do that, and no one wants to delete a game that they just bought last week. So, unless you want to invest in a bunch of $30 carts, in practice, Nintendo Power felt like more of a rental service. If you were buying to own, it made more sense to shop at a used game store. They were cheaper, and you also got the original box, manual, and usually stuff like maps. Lawson let you print out a little how-to-play sheet for 25 cents, but obviously that doesn't have the charm or collectability of the original packaging. The final problem, convenience. The Loppy screen didn't look like this, where you just click what you want to buy. Instead, you had to search through a catalog or Nintendo's website, or the Loppy itself to find each game's 6-digit ID number, then type it in to select your games. It was super tedious and really didn't have to be that way. After all that, figuring out the math on how many blocks your games needed, and finding all the 6-digit ID numbers, the Loppy would print out your receipt and you'd take it up to the Lawson's cashier, because it's actually them that would rewrite your games on a separate machine called a game writer. The Japanese fans we talked to said because hardly anyone used Nintendo Power, cashiers weren't familiar with the system, so it was a pain getting your orders filled. Then you'd have to kill a few minutes while the writer loaded your games. There are even more steps we're not going to bore you with, but the point is, Nintendo had to make comics and tutorials explaining how it all worked because the whole process was so confusing. Now you know what we meant when we said the devil was in the details. All 4 of these problems were completely avoidable, ideally with more advertising, bigger cartridges, and a better designed customer experience. Nintendo Power revenue was never made public, which suggests it wasn't good, or else they would have bragged about it. But we do have official financial statements for how many Super Famicom games sold in total. So that's new physical sales and Nintendo Power rewrites combined, and it pains me to say, at no point did they crack 1 million games a year, even in their best years. For context, most previous years measured in the tens of millions. Even if we were going to be generous and assume every game after 1997 sold through Nintendo Power and none were physical sales, that would mean the system was only responsible for 1% of the console's lifetime sales. If you're only going to take away one figure from this video, that's the one to remember, that at most, only 1% of Super Famicom sales were from Nintendo Power. Break those numbers down and you'll find the average Loppy wasn't selling thousands of games, or even hundreds. It was actually selling dozens. Only a few dozen games a year at each store. So, point is, Nintendo Power massively failed to revitalize the Super Famicom, as the company had hoped. So they dropped the price of Nintendo Power exclusives down to $25, but by then, it was too late. Nintendo ended up releasing a lot of them on cartridge a few months later to try and make back some of their investment. The system was a certified flop, and Monthly Nintendo Power magazine was canned after its very first issue. It was a monthly magazine that ran for only 1 month. At the start, Nintendo Power had a goal of 300 games, but they barely managed to hit 150. They said the more popular it got, the more games it would get, but unfortunately, it just was not popular. Remember Nintendo's 14 back catalog classics available on launch day? They never added a single old game after that, except Link to the Past 3 years later. I guess they realized pretty quick their third pillar wasn't going to hold much weight. Third-party publishers stopped bringing theirs over too, not long after. As for new games, the initial promise was 1 or 2 a month, but even towards the end of the first year, months started getting skipped. Missed months became more and more frequent until eventually, nothing. They at least managed to go out on a high note with the system's final release, Metal Slayer Glory Director's Cut. It was a remake of HAL Labs' sci-fi cult classic with improved graphics and cut content added back in. Second-hand copies of the Famicom original sold for $300 at the time, so it was a perfect Nintendo Power release, and a fitting farewell. If Nintendo had worked out some of the kinks, the system could have been profitable enough to make even more games, like they originally planned. At the start, Nintendo Power had a secret list of 30 games from various old consoles they wanted to remake or enhance port for Super Famicom, but only a dozen came out. At one point, Nintendo discussed the possibility of remaking the original Mother with updated graphics and new content, and Marigold said a new Game Freak game was on the list too, though they were intentionally vague about which one. If they meant a remake of Generation 1 Pokemon, that would have been awesome. It's possible they meant another new Game Freak game, like the one they released right after for the PC Engine called Bizarre DYKG no Game DYKG, but that would have been a pretty weird pick. As for what else was on that secret list, we can only guess. Zelda 2 was famously the Miyamoto game he was most dissatisfied with, so that would have been a good candidate. Metroid, Kid Icarus, and countless more Famicom classics come to mind as well. Nintendo only remade one Game Boy game, Kirby's Star Stacker, but plenty more could have benefited from facelifts and new content, like some of the Mario Land, Donkey Kong Land, and Game Boy Wars entries. Third-party oldies were on the table too, and considering Konami was far and away Nintendo Power's biggest supporter, it's not outside the realm of possibility some of their classics were under consideration as well, either by Marigold and friends or Konami themselves. Konami's Super Castlevania 4 was already a reimagining of Castlevania 1, so it would have been cool to see Castlevania 2 and 3 get the same treatment, or Konami's first couple Metal Gears that originally released on MSX. That full list of 30 was never made public, but it's fun to imagine the remakes that might have been. And more Satellaview ports definitely should have come over, like BS The Legend of Zelda, a remake of the Famicom original, or BSF Zero Grand Prix 1 and 2, which were basically expansions with more tracks and cars. Dozens of Satella games became lost media due to their broadcast format, so more not finding their way into the Let's Preserve the Good Games project is an absolute travesty. Nintendo originally said Satellaview games would be, quote, easy to bring over, but only a handful ever did. Something else we didn't mention earlier was Nintendo Power's third initiative. In addition to the Let's Preserve Good Games and Star Wars projects, there was also the Sound Novel project. Basically, the goal was creating some new visual novels for the system, and Marigold was in negotiations with some mystery and romance authors during the soft launch period. But that didn't work out either. A lot of their plans got abandoned, but to be fair, the system's failure wasn't entirely their fault. Even if they fixed all the fumbles we talked about earlier, there were still a couple headwinds beyond their control. First of all, as we alluded to earlier, the legality of used games was under threat. Japan's CESA and publishers like Sony, Square, Capcom, and Konami argued in court that Japanese law should treat games the same as films. Basically, that it's illegal for shops to sell second-hand copies or rent them out without the publisher's permission, and that gamers should only be able to buy games new at full price. In 1998, they embarked on a crusade called the Campaign to Eliminate Illegal Used Software. Because of that Japanese film law, their position was used games already were illegal, and they ran publicity events telling gamers and shops they were breaking the law and sued stores to prevent secondhand sales. But ultimately, they lost. Nintendo wasn't involved in those lawsuits, but the court's ruling effectively made the Let's Preserve Good Games project pointless, not to mention profitless. We're not saying we wanted those lawsuits to go through, but if used games were outlawed, Nintendo Power would have stood a much better chance at success. The other headwind was something called DigiCube. It's a bit more complicated than we need to get into, but long story short, DigiCubes were Squaresoft vending machines set up in 7-Elevens and other stores that weren't Lawson's. A few dozen publishers signed up with DigiCube, and in a way, they were Nintendo Power's competition. DigiCube had a lot more commercials and quickly proved more successful, with almost 10 million software sold in its first year alone. Since they were with DigiCube, Square, Enix, and others didn't participate in Nintendo's competing system, which meant some of the Super Famicom's best RPGs, like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, were never included in Nintendo Power. So, all that's to say, even if Nintendo did everything right, losing the best RPGs and also losing to used game stores left Nintendo Power kinda screwed in Japan. But, you know, it didn't have to only be in Japan. Probably the biggest reason Nintendo Power failed, even more so than the fumbles we talked about earlier, was not releasing its exclusives in America. If they had localized those games and sold them on cartridge, it would have brought a lot more money into the system. Now, it is true that Super Famicom sold more games in Japan over the console's lifetime, but in the years that Nintendo Power was most active, Americans were actually buying 10 times more than Japanese fans. Over 12 million Super Nintendo games in 1998 alone. Nintendo's forecasts were way off on this one, and by not exporting those exclusives, they lost out on 90% of potential sales. They thought their last generation console could live on in Japan, but it couldn't. But it was still alive in the US. An argument could be made that Nintendo Power should have actually been set up in American convenience stores. I mean, obviously it'd be nice if the system was available worldwide, but if they were gonna pick one country, they picked wrong. They would have made a lot more money in the United States. So yeah, it was a bust. But don't count them out just yet, because before long, Nintendo Power came back for round 2. From the very beginning, Loppy had Game Boy cartridge slots installed right next to the Super Famicom slots. And just as the 16-bit releases were drying up, Nintendo announced that Game Boy Nintendo Power would commence in November '99. And on paper at least, it had a lot more potential for success. It was still current-gen hardware, with the Game Boy Advance still a ways off, and at the time, Game Boy was actually Nintendo's most profitable pillar, outselling N64 and Super Famicom combined. Much of that was thanks to Pokémon, and the upcoming Pokémon Gold and Silver were also going to launch in November 1999. So Japanese gamers were going to have their Game Boys close at hand and hopefully ready to try out Nintendo Power GB as soon as they finished their Johto journeys. The timing was nearly perfect, but, and there's always a but, once again, a problem arose that was out of Nintendo's control. An act of God, actually.
严重受损，921大地震凸显活动断层的危险性，而横亘全岛的活动断层带可能就有51条。
5 weeks before launch, a massive earthquake shook Taiwan, in what locals call the quake of the century. It killed 2,500 people. It destroyed 50,000 buildings, and it inflicted immeasurable damage to the island and its economy. It also severely disrupted their semiconductor manufacturing, which just so happens is where Nintendo got their semiconductors to make cartridges. Several N64 games got delayed, copies of Gold and Silver available on release day were cut almost in half, leading to shortages, and Nintendo Power GB's launch got delayed 4 months, till March 2000. Their carefully planned timing was ruined. Syncing up with Pokemon was no longer possible, and Game Boy Advance was considerably closer to launch. When March finally arrived, Nintendo put out a banger back catalogue of 30 first-party classics and 45 more from third parties. Mario, Donkey Kong, Zelda, Metroid, Kirby, Game Boy Wars, Castlevania, and more. Only about $7 each, and Game Boy flashcards were pretty cheap too. Only $20 instead of $30. To sweeten the deal, Nintendo gave away free downloads for Wario Land and also held out Super Mario Bros. Deluxe like a carrot on a stick. It was basically a remake of the Famicom original with some additional content, and it had already released overseas the previous year. But in Japan, they made it a Nintendo Power exclusive to attract more eyes to the system. Unfortunately, the same old problem still persisted. Very little advertising, clunky UI, and all the rest, especially the storage space issue. Game Boy flashcards only held 1 megabyte, which once again meant you might only be able to fit 1 or 2 games. Nintendo obfuscated financial reports by lumping rewrite sales in with physical sales again, so it's hard to get precise figures. They couldn't have been good though, because after launch, Nintendo only released 5 more games. 4 old ones, and 1 that was only kinda new. Balloon Fight GB, which was a remake of Balloon Kid, now with colour and a little extra content. The original never came out in Japan, but still, it wasn't super exciting. Before launch, Nintendo said they were considering making new exclusives and pricing them at $17, but they never ended up releasing any. They were quick to throw in the towel, and by September, they were done. Nintendo withdrew support after only 6 months on the market. Third parties stayed on 1 more year, mostly adding back catalogs, because why not? Somewhat living up to the promise of what Nintendo Power was supposed to be from the outset, a few foreign games made their way to Japan for the first time, like Batman Beyond and F1 World Grand Prix. And 10 new games, though none were especially compelling. Just Uproar in Karamu Town, I'll Have Another, Kogulugulu, Gulugulu to Nakayoshi, Surfing Dudes, Shogi Brain Teasers, and 6 low-price loppy puzzle titles. Long story short, there weren't many new games, and what little was there wasn't very desirable. A year after the last few games limped over the finish line, Nintendo Power announced they were leaving Lawson in August 2002. Loppy cartridge slots would get covered up, and rewritable flashcards no longer sold. You could still rewrite games, but you'd have to do it with Nintendo directly, by mailing in your cartridge with a form saying what games you wanted. Financial reports show sales of a few thousand titles for the first couple years of the mail-in service, then dropping to near zero in the years that followed. Game Boy sales weren't much better. To their credit, Nintendo continued the service a lot longer than it probably made sense to. But in February 2007, they announced Nintendo Power was shutting down completely at the end of the month. The Wii Virtual Console just came out, so even for the sake of preserving old games, Nintendo Power just didn't need to exist anymore. Another way of looking at it is that's what Nintendo Power became. The Let's Preserve Good Games project evolved into Virtual Console. In fact, a lot of Nintendo Power exclusives eventually found their way over. You could also say the Star Wars project sort of turned into WiiWare, which had tons of exclusives like Pokemon Ranch and Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth, a remake of the 1989 Game Boy entry, and exactly the kind of thing we wanted to see more of back on Nintendo Power. Virtual Console and WiiWare also fixed a lot of the old problems, like the clunky interface, low storage, and being able to re-download games for free after you delete them, not to mention being available worldwide. We might have sounded harsh in this video, but quite the contrary, we love Nintendo Power. it was ahead of its time, even if it was simultaneously behind the times in some ways. It gave us games that otherwise never would have existed, and a lot of them eventually got English fan translations, so we can play them on emulator. Some even got officially released in the West just recently, like Kirby Superstar Stacker in 2023 and Wrecking Crew 98 in 2024. And that's great, but we can't help wishing the system had been a success, so we got even more. It sure would have been cool to see what kind of games came to Nintendo Power N64, which was planned, but once again, never became a reality. At the very least, we know they already had Zelda Master Quest sitting in their vault. They also had Pokemon Picross, and it's honestly puzzling they never dropped it on Nintendo Power GB. It was a fully realized game with Ash and the gang, which finished development in early '99, and more impressive than the Picross games they did put out. Nintendo decided not to release it at the time because they had too many Pokemon games coming out all at once. 6 games in 6 months, they said, was too much Pokemon. Then they never ended up releasing it at all. So why not dust it off and advertise it as Nintendo Power's exclusive Pokemon game? The entire reason Game Boy was still popular was because of Pokemon. So it seems like another fumble that Nintendo Power never got any Pokemon games, even from the back catalogue. Or at the very least, they could have updated some old Game Boy titles with colour. They already did that for Link's Awakening, Wario Land 2, Donkey Kong Land 3, and a few others, and released them on Cartridge. None of the Gen 1 Pokemon games had proper colour, so why not draw people in with a colour version of Yellow? The 1998 Nintendo Sourcebook showed a colorized Metroid 2 with new areas. It's unknown if it was actually in development or just a screenshot mock-up. But regardless, those sort of upgrades coming to Nintendo Power would have been quick, easy, and much appreciated. And just like Super Nintendo, it's worth noting that more Game Boy games were selling in America than Japan at the time. So I just want to reiterate, some of these pipe dreams might have actually happened if they did Nintendo Power in the land of the free instead of the rising sun. But okay, at this point, I'm just Monday morning quarterbacking, veering into wish-casting territory. So let's get back to the hard facts and wrap things up. Nintendo Power lasted just shy of a decade, from September 97 till its closure in February 2007. By then, the Wii and DS were already out and exploding in popularity, which made Super Famicom and Game Boy 2 generations old and dead as dust. Not counting the 8 Nintendo Power Picrosses and 6 loppy puzzles, about 30 new games and remakes came to the system, with Fire Emblem and Mario as its all-time best sellers. Nintendo supported the system longer than they had to, and a lot longer than most other companies would have. And there's something to be said for that. They've always been an experimental company, and by their very nature, experiments don't always succeed. The mid-90s was probably their most experimental era, and even if Nintendo Power ended in failure, we're glad we got as much as we did. It's a hell of a lot better than nothing at all. Again, thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to play it for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox now by using our link in the description or pinned comment. New players and those who haven't played in the last 6 months will get a massive bonus pack across all platforms, including premium vehicles and more. This is available for a limited time only, so act fast and claim your rewards today. Did you also know the Nintendo 64 DD had over 60 cancelled games? If you want to hear more about every last one of them, click the video on screen. Or if you'd rather see an hour of random Super Nintendo trivia, maybe for background watching or something, click the other video. Special thanks to FamiWiki admin Brendan and Satellaview enthusiast Cabasses for consultation, Chef Kyaru for scanning one of the rarest Famitsu issues for us, Jacob for translating, and all the Japanese fans who shared their experiences with Nintendo Power back in the day. And thank you for watching. We will see you next time.